Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and this is The Wright Show. You are Kevin Carey. You are Director of the Education Policy Program at New America, formerly known as the New America Foundation, but apparently now in streamlined form.
Yes, we'll be new next year. Just
Yeah.
new. But
You're going to go with that instead of
yeah,
America?
right.
Yeah, well, that,
definitely.
leftist that you are. Okay, well, you are also the author of the new book, The End of College, Creating the Future of Learning and the University of Everywhere. There have been books about the end of history, the end of power, the end of science, the end of faith. I guess we might as well bring college to an end if all those things are ending. But how literally do you mean the end of college? You're obviously talking about the effect of technology on higher education, but how worried should people who run colleges be?
Fairly worried, although it depends a lot on which colleges they're running. The broad thesis of the book is partly a history of how American higher education came to where it is today, which I believe is too expensive, increasingly unaffordable, particularly for middle-income and low-income students.
I'm with you there. I'm in the middle of the payment process, and I'm with you there.
All right. Well, the book is too late for you then, so sorry about that.
Sure is.
And also, I think not sufficiently focused on educating undergraduate students, particularly the never more diverse undergraduate students that we have today. Mm-hmm. I think this is a big problem, and I think it needs to change. I think it will change. So the book partly tells the story of how we got here, and then it talks about how information technology is in the midst of and will continue to really alter the economic foundations and possibilities of higher education, leading to something that I coined the University of Everywhere. So it's the end of college. It's by no means the end of higher education. We need higher education more than ever in today's society. But I think we're headed into a world where, unlike now, we don't only rely on a specific set of institutions, most of which were built a long time ago, that operate in a certain set of sometimes very peculiar ways. I think that when my daughter goes to college, my daughter's 4, so that'll be 14 years from now, I think that she'll be able to choose from either something that has the same name as an existing college and operates sort of like existing colleges do. Some people will, go to school on a purely online basis, or even, whatever engaging with technology
is that what
means.
The University of Everywhere refers to? That anyone, anywhere will have access to all kinds of courses emanating from all kinds of places, or what?
Yes, broadly speaking, but I think there's also a third leg of the stool in the future. Mm-hmm. Traditional colleges, purely online colleges, but I also think that we now, the conditions are very favorable, or will be soon, to create all kinds of new higher learning organizations that aren't necessarily colleges as we've known them, and that really combine the best of belonging to an authentic learning community where you live and learn among other people, but also allows access to global learning communities, which I think are going to be increasingly prevalent as technology continues to knit the world together. Mm-hmm. We've never really been able to make organizations like that before, but I think we can now, and I think that those kind of organizations will play a big role. So put the three together, that's the University of Everywhere.
Okay. Now, so you're a believer in the transformative power of technology here. There was a kind of a wave of techno-euphoria, or at least techno-enthusiasm or something, a few years ago when people first heard the acronym MOOC, Massive Online Open Course, unless I've got the two O's reversed.
You do, yeah.
I do, okay. Massive Open Online, whatever. And they were going to be transformative. And then there was this counter wave of publicity about how, well, it turns out the attrition rates in the courses are really high and blah, blah, blah. I think your view is that we should not be misled by the counterwave of publicity, that big things are in store, and that there is something in MOOCs that are ultimately going to be very important.
Yeah, the MOOC phenomenon, however you want to talk about it, was a very interesting thing to watch for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's not as if online courses were invented 3 years ago. A year before that, in 2011, there were millions of students taking classes online from accredited universities all over the world in the United States. Um, what was different was that the most elite American universities all of a sudden began to engage with online education, and that they began to make these classes available for free. Mm-hmm. So before MOOCs, you could take an online class from the University of Phoenix or Arizona State University or your local community college, pay regular tuition, and get credit. But the elite institutions had kind of stayed out of it. Now we have this situation where Harvard, Stanford, Berkeley, pretty much most of the elite American research universities are all one way or the other providing classes that they stand behind with their good name and providing them to people for free. And because American institutions are so attractive to people and so well known around the world, the response was pretty amazing. You had all of a sudden tens of thousands of people, if not more, signing up for the opportunity to be part of what were, in some ways, really global learning communities. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, there was this kind of pushback. I think there's a very sort of familiar cycle of hype and disappointment that we see with all kinds of innovations where something happens, people overpromise, it fails to deliver to that part, partly because the promises were too much too soon, partly because there's always iteration and imperfections. There's a lot of disappointment. We stopped thinking about them for a while, and then about 7 or 8 years later, all that stuff was still happening, and a lot of the promises actually do sort of start to come true. So I think we're sort of in the ebb tide part of that cycle with certain kinds of online higher education, but I actually think, the important thing is that there are more MOOCs now than ever before, and more people are taking part in them, and they continue to improve.
And I think your view is that one reason they haven't had more impact than they've had is that so far, with most of these courses, you have received no actual course credit that has tangible value, right? And that it's going to be the changing of that's going to be the big threshold.
Yeah, I think that one of the interesting things about taking anything, in this case higher education, and shifting it into new modes of delivery and associating it with new organizations is that all the different pieces start to get picked apart, and you can see them a little more clearly for what they really are. And what I think is clear is that when people go to college, what they're really paying for is the credential. They're paying to learn, they need skills, but the credential is really what matters. The credential is the economic foundation of higher education as we know it now. It's why colleges can continue to raise prices and people will continue to borrow ever larger amounts of money to go there because our whole employment system is set up around traditional college degrees.
Right. But you're probably talking more about liberal arts than, say, engineering when you say that they're mainly after the credential, right? People getting hired by Google out of college and paid $110,000 are being paid because of actual skills that they can demonstrate, right?
Sure. Although, in the tech industry, the tech industry is actually one of the less credentialist industries we have because it's not regulated and you can show your work, and particularly if you're in the web development work and you can code and stuff like that. Right. So, part of the confusion is that our colleges and universities encompass so many different missions, and really it's the incoherence of that I talk about in the book that is one of the reasons that college has become so expensive and so kind of unconcerned with student learning. So I think that, yeah, absolutely, there are some mostly kind of skills and vocational focused traditional college classes where absolutely you are learning a lot of skills. That's why you're there. That is very real. But in a lot of, and then I think there are some kind of colleges where mostly it's a selectivity signal. I was smart enough to get into this college, is most of what your degree says. I think, however, there's a lot of people in the middle where mostly what the college degree says is, I got out of bed. I'm the kind of person who was able to accumulate 120 credits, which means that I'm, not a complete screw up. I can follow rules, and employers want that.
As Woody Allen said, 99% or whatever it was of success is showing up. So that does mean something if you can get a college degree. Okay, so kind of paint us the picture of this changing. Okay, so and let's say you're a liberal arts major, for example.
Right.
Right now you're spending 4 years at a college. You're imagining a world where you can take specific courses and get actual credit for them, and in various other ways actually demonstrate to potential employers what you've learned. And I think that's a big part of it for you, is the way that the data illustrating your expertise will be online to show people. So how is my life different? Like right now I'm planning to go to this liberal arts school, but then I encounter the world of the future and I do what instead, or what in addition to, or what?
Well, I think of liberal arts education and employment-focused education as somewhat different. And so I actually think I see two different futures for those two different parts of higher education that are kind of put together right now. I think gradually both regulators and employers will get used to the idea that we can have credentials other than traditional college degrees. Mm-hmm. And once that happens, then people can actually start to assemble all of these open educational resources, or like not free but much less expensive educational resources. Mm-hmm. Make a plausible case to students that, hey, you don't need to borrow, 50 grand to get a 4-year degree in business. You can spend a year and a half and do this, get right into the job market. This is a better path for you. The liberal arts, I actually have almost an entirely different way of thinking about. I think that probably, like, for example, the most common degree in American higher education is the bachelor's degree in business.
Okay.
4 years is probably too long if all you want to do is sort of like get into the white collar workforce, and you're probably wasting money. By contrast, I think 4 years is not nearly long enough if you really want to get a liberal arts education. I think that's almost the project of a lifetime to really learn how to think and expose yourself to the great thinking of different cultures and different modes of inquiry and all of those things. And so for that, I think people will actually maintain what I would characterize as sort of looser ongoing affiliations with educational communities that might last 10 or 15 years as you really deeply engage in a lot of these liberal arts questions. And then you get the knowledge and skills that you need to a job through a different kind of mode.
So this 11-year thing that's happening kind of online, or what?
Well, I don't think it has to be all online. I think if you just think about what you need in order to really learn well in college, you need other students. You need a relationship, I think, with an educational organization that's going to have a culture and mores and values and provide some structure and some mentorship. You need relationships with some people who are older and wiser and smarter than you. I think you can make some place like that has access to a world of educational resources in a way that doesn't look very much like a huge college research university and isn't as expensive. I think the startup costs for creating a new college are like radically lower than they used to be.
Okay. There's an irony that just occurred to me, which is that, on the one hand, you're making the case for more online learning and more, kind of specified learning. I mean, you take this course and that course and this course, rather than having to meet some broad-based requirements. And you're making that case partly on grounds that what education's current efficiency lies in the fact that it's largely a credentialing exercise. And yet, I would say that if you look at the kinds of skills that people are going to demonstrate in this new world and acquire in this new world via online learning, okay, people in those films, like engineering, like pharmacology, like accounting, whatever, those are actually the people who, even now at college, are not just in a credentialing exercise. They are actually learning. They're taking courses that teach them that stuff, right? I mean, so you know what I mean? I mean, you've got on the one hand the liberal arts student who just isn't sure what they want to do, and so they don't know what online courses they would take anyway that would actually be respected by an employer, right? And then on the other hand, you've got the students who can make use of this online world, but I'm guessing they're making pretty good use of college in a very pragmatic way, right? They're learning programming, they're learning math, they're learning science. Does that make sense? Does that question make sense?
I think so. I guess we have to keep in mind the difference between, first of all, we have to keep in mind the difference between a reasonable sense of what a really good college education is and the kind of college education that people are actually getting now in colleges. And I think there's a pretty big distance between those things in a lot of cases.
Okay, so what's your definition of a good college education? What people should get for their money?
I think to have a good college education, you need to have a sustained relationship with an educational organization that has a strong theory of what learning and education are, that is willing to give you advice and mentorship and structure to go through an educational program that has coherence and some kind of goals, that puts you into strong ongoing relationships with other learners and with mentors of some kind. I think that's a good college education. I think that can happen in all kinds of different ways. I think that a significant part of that experience, it's going to vary by subject a lot, can be intermediated through technology in some way, just as you and I are talking right now.
Sure, but it doesn't. But some of that doesn't scale well. Like mentoring, you can do it online, but you can't magically give a single person 1 million proteges to mentor, right?
Absolutely. Which is why it's not going to be free. It's just going to be a lot cheaper. So the things that can scale will scale. The things that don't scale won't scale. Right now, basically colleges don't scale anything other than stuffing a lot of people in a big lecture hall, which I guess is a kind of low-grade scaling. So, like, here's an example. There's a nonprofit university, fully accredited, called Western Governors University. It's been around for a while. It was actually started in the 1990s, well before MOOCs. Services mostly an adult clientele. All of their classes are focused on preparing people for business, education, and healthcare, because that's where all the white-collar jobs are in America that people want to get. So the learning experience is primarily an online one. People don't... They're not part of classes. They log on from their homes. These are mostly almost all people with jobs, but everybody has a human mentor that is assigned to them, with whom they have an ongoing relationship that can last years, that helps guide them through the process. So that's not scalable, which is why Western Governors University costs thousands of dollars. It just doesn't cost tens of thousands of dollars, because they scale the stuff that can scale and they don't scale the stuff that can't.
Okay, another dimension of this you mentioned is the social interaction with other students. And I think, first of all, I'd say that beyond credentialing, one thing even, and maybe particularly elite institutions do, is that. I mean, it's not, the employer isn't just thinking, well, they were good enough to get into Harvard or Princeton or Yale or Stanford. I think they may be thinking, whether or not they are, it's true. They spent 4 years hanging out with the kinds of people who got into that institution. So whatever their deficiencies may have been in their social skills going in and their ability to communicate diplomatically with people and so on, some of that probably got enriched, right? And you recognize that kind of value in the current real institution, right?
Absolutely. I mean, like all things, it has some value. It's not unlimited. There was actually an interesting book that came out earlier this year by Richard Aram and Josep Aroxa, who wrote a pretty well-known book that came out a few years ago called Academically Adrift. It was a study of how much students learn in college. They found the answer was not very much in a lot of cases. And so in their follow-up book, they actually followed college graduates out into the workforce to see what happened to them and sort of asked them, like, in retrospect, what did you value about education? And they were sociologists, so it was a very conversational kind of research. People have really learned to go to college to value the social part of it. Over and over again, their responses to their subjects were, oh yeah, some of the classes were good, some of them weren't, but I really learned how to engage with diverse people, and I really learned how to socialize and all this stuff. But when they then asked them, how did you get your job? Very little of the people of their economic success or failure had anything to do one way or the other with the social relationships that they formed in college. A few did. But it wasn't very much.
Yeah, but I'm not just talking about networking. Right. I'm just talking like I found out about the job through this person I knew at college. That's the kind of thing the student would be conscious of. But I think there are all kinds of social benefits that they would not be able to consciously link to later success or to their employer's interest in them or anything else.
Sure. So there's two big populations of college students. There's your traditional age, just out of high school, 18 to 22-year-olds, which is large. And then there's everyone else, which is adults, people with families, people with jobs, people with kids, part-time students. So socialization is mostly for the first group, the coming-of-age experience. It's super important. It might be the single biggest reason that people send their kids to college and pay for all this money. It might be the thing that people value most in retrospect years later. My argument is this. You can create a place that 18-year-olds can live in and get a good education in, and that provides all that socialization at a fraction of the cost of what the current places are charging today, and doesn't have a lot of the almost insanely extravagant expense and cross-subsidization that are really endemic in a lot of those institutions. And so because that's important and because people will want that, new institutions will be built to serve that need, but they'll be much better at education and they'll be much cheaper.
Okay. So you don't imagine this kind of critical socializing so much taking place online.
No.
Okay, even when we have like virtual reality and so on.
No.
You're not seeing that anytime soon. So you imagine a substantial number of students still going to a physical place where they meet other students, but there are going to be these big savings through presumably things like they can choose to take a course from some professor who's maybe, thousands of miles away and is teaching 10,000 students. So obviously, that's cheaper per student. That's going to be one of the big savings, I guess, right? What are the other savings you envision?
I think what you just described is an awful lot. I mean, if we can get to that would be a big change. And I actually give an example of an institution that I think kind of looks like that in my book. It's a real college. It's a public university. It's the University of Minnesota's branch campus in Rochester, Minnesota, which they built there because the Mayo Clinic is in Rochester, Minnesota. So instead of actually like buying a lot of land and like rebuilding a university, they rented out empty commercial space 2 blocks from the Mayo Clinic. It was an abandoned food court in kind of an old, failed urban mall. There are only 2 college majors at the University of Minnesota Rochester: health sciences and I think it's health sciences administration. None of the classes are bigger than 30. There are biologists, chemists, philosophy professors, writing professors, and all of these professors from different disciplines actually coordinate their class curriculum, which never happens in regular college campuses where the philosophy department's over here and the English department's over there, and they don't talk and don't even really like each other. And they charge the same tuition that you would pay to go to any other University of Minnesota campus, but the thing is, it costs the state almost nothing. It's basically being run on tuition. There's almost no public subsidy there. And it's because the kids work out at the YMCA. They rent apartments nearby. There's no infrastructure. There's no real waste. And it's very technologically oriented. There's no library. They kind of use interlibrary loan for libraries, or they just get all the things that you can get on a laptop right now.
Do they really socialize with each other nearly as much as at a traditional university? Because one thing I think would happen, if they're all picking from an infinite catalog of courses online, they're almost never going to be taking the same course as a fellow student, as somebody else on campus.
Well, but most of their classes are the same classes. And so the core classes in their discipline, in their health sciences, are the same classes. They are taking there on campus, like with professors who live there. And then the extra stuff, if they want to take Shakespeare or some kind of wacky philosophy class or something like that, that's what technology provides.
Okay, but to the extent that that's the case, you're not getting the big saving from the online education per se, which is one thing you envision happening, right?
You are because one of the reasons that traditional institutions are so expensive is because they were built in an era where if you wanted to provide a comprehensive education, you had to have at least one department of everything.
Right.
And there's a lot of things. You had to have a library that could be used across the entire range of scholarship. You don't have to do that now. And I want to say they had social lives. Absolutely. They lived there. If you put a bunch of 19-year-olds living together, like they socialized, they played games, they did stuff like that. You know what they didn't have? They didn't have some of the really terrible socialization that happens on college campuses. There wasn't nearly the same culture of alcohol consumption because there was no sort of like industrial alcohol consumption infrastructure that you have in a lot of college towns. And they were busier because, frankly, their classes were a lot more demanding and it took a lot more work. And that's, frankly, like the bad thing that everyone knows about American colleges is they're super expensive. The bad thing that no one really knows is that they're not that hard and a lot of students don't learn very much.
Okay. Now, you just had a piece in the New York Times that rose pretty high in the most emailed list, and I read that, and I was reading the comments, and I read a comment by somebody who has apparently followed your work, and they make an allegation that I want you to respond to.
Sure.
What never changes is Mr. Carey's chirpy utilitarian vision that sees higher education as a vehicle for turning human beings into corporate cogs. Mr. Carey flogs the same idea that prestigious colleges such as Harvard are inherently unjust, that knowledge and information are interchangeable, that the measurable parts of the brain are all that matter, and that young adults are no more than goopy machines that, quote, learn best when plugged into computers. His vision is one of an egalitarian and atomistic education where each student, isolated from others, works at a computer terminal until ready for the job market. Well, I think we can already see that not all of that is true, but what do you think is like the fundamental misconception there? And is there anything that is true?
I mean, I don't agree with any of that. I mean, my book says very explicitly, and I'm quoting from memory here, the future of higher education is not solitary. Learning at the University of Everywhere is not a future in which we all are sitting in our basements in front of computers. Like, that's not at all the vision of the future that my book lays out. So probably that commenter hasn't read the book. It's not really in any way the future that I want, or that I think would be a good idea, or that I think will come true.
Okay. At the same time, there will be tendencies drawing us there, right? I mean, like if I'm 19 years old and I know exactly what I want to do this kind of computer programming, or, you know, something in science or some other part of engineering, or maybe even law or something technical but not scientific. And I can, in principle, in your world, right? I mean, ultimately, you're going to be getting these specific little credentials for each course, and I'm going to be, in principle, able to aggregate the credentials I got from each course, show them to somebody, get the job. So why am I not going to be tempted to kind of do it from my laptop in my basement, especially if I just don't have much money, and it's you know, I can't really afford to pay to go even to a you know, kind of a cheaper campus than the kind that exists.
Well, if you don't have very much money, and what you just described will get you a job, I'm not quite sure what you just described is a bad thing. Because
I'm not saying it's a bad thing.
Right.
It's just that you said it's wrong to imagine that you envision a world where we're all kind of doing it in our basements on our computers.
Right.
But I'm saying actually part of the future world will, I think, maybe be a certain amount of just doing it from home, not meeting any other students. I'm not saying that's necessarily good or bad, but not meeting them offline anyway. So I'm just saying, isn't a certain amount of the technology moving at least a certain fraction of the population in that direction?
So, I mean, what you just described is what some people want and what a lot of people are already doing. There are hundreds of thousands of American college students today whose engagement with higher education is either already online or, before that, you know, give the kids dinner, get in the car, drive to the local campus of your community college or university, go to your one-night class that you're taking a week, finish, get in your car, drive home. Right. It is a very practical approach to higher education. There are many, many, many people who need that, who want that, and that's what makes sense for them. If we can provide that, a better version of that for less money, I think that would be a great thing. Again, that's sort of the contrast to the person who wants socialization and needs socialization. So there's always this kind of push and pull between different goals, and I mean, you can posit almost any plausible set of circumstances and goals for somebody, and it fits into kind of our broad universe of higher education somewhere. So are you concerned that that person will be missing an opportunity that they're getting now or that they should get?
Oh, I'm not expressing a concern of my own at all. I'm just trying to get a sense for how much things are going to change. You know, how many people 10, 20 years from now are still going to be going to traditional colleges in the sense that we think of it now. Let me ask maybe somewhat the same question in a different way.
Sure.
What kinds of institutions should be most worried about losing their clientele and possibly even ceasing to exist? What kinds of colleges are in most trouble?
No, that's a good question. There's a little bit in the book where I was interviewing a professor at Harvard named Robert Liu, who's the faculty director of HarvardX, which is the Harvard part of the edX online consortium. And he told me that he was at some meeting with the faculty about whether they should do this, and someone raised their hand and said, "Aren't you building a doomsday machine here?" I think the answer is yes. I don't think that Harvard is building a doomsday machine for Harvard. They might be building some kind of doomsday machine for a bunch of four-year institutions that are about 70 percentiles down the distribution from Harvard. There's been a big
down in what in terms of how their selectivity,
resources, and prestige. I think there are some big, relatively new, comprehensive four-year institutions that aren't selective, that don't specialize really in any particular kind of academic program. I think there are also a lot of less resourced private colleges that fall into this category. We saw Sweetbriar College went out of business. Small liberal arts, women only college in Virginia just went out of business last week, shutting its doors down. A lot of these institutions have been swept up in kind of the long evolution of the existing college model becoming more and more expensive. They've been kind of getting by getting more clever in terms of differentiating their tuition. Maybe you can get some Chinese students to enroll and pay you full tuition for a while, kind of keep the doors open. But the kind of education that they're offering isn't really special. And as online education gets better and better and better, I think new organizations will appear that can make a much, much better value proposition. Those kind of institutions will struggle. I think they're most at risk.
Although in theory, all of them could transform themselves into the kind of institution you imagine in the future.
They absolutely could. I think history tells us that organizations are bad at transforming themselves. It is never easy. So some do, some don't.
Okay. And what kinds of professors should be most concerned in terms of discipline? I mean, comp lit professors, engineering professors. Who's going to have find their jobs most imperiled 10 years from now?
I think professors in those institutions that I just described. You know, I mean, we have
So it's not a discipline by discipline thing as much as a college by college thing?
I think it is probably the intersection of those colleges and the humanities. And I say that like with genuine concern. I think in one of the things that we do with the inefficiency of the existing college model is subsidize scholarship and research that doesn't have any immediate value in the labor market. So if you're running an expensive chemistry lab that's being supported by the NIH, then that'll continue to happen because basically that transaction has really nothing to do with education. It's just all about the government subsidizing research. I think that if you are on the tenure track in the English department at a lower tier comprehensive public university, I think that career path is going to be jeopardized in the future. And I think that we as a society need to start thinking hard now about how much we value that kind of academic work and what our other mechanisms are going to be to subsidize it, because I think that the way we're doing it now is going to be less tenable.
Seems to me you could kind of argue it either way as to whether humanities professors are going to be more vulnerable than, say, science and engineering professors. What I mean is, on the one hand, it's true that there are a lot of students who take humanities courses now, notwithstanding their lack of obvious vocational relevance, just because they go to a college, a traditional college. There are these distribution requirements. Also, you have the freedom to take some things that just interest you, even if they may have no vocational payoff. So right now, there's a demand for courses in the humanities that may not persist once education is more geared to actual vocational utility. On the other hand, when you look at what kinds of teaching scale well, right, like engineering, science, the best science and engineering professors, I think, in the world of the future may have hundreds of thousands of students, and the mediocre ones may not have any students, right? Whereas in the humanities, because the teaching doesn't scale as well, and it depends more on like professors actually reading essays you've written, seminars, and so on, in that sense, right, you might say that humanities professors are less threatened by the future technology?
Well, I think one of the things that humanities professors have going in their favor is that I agree with you about that, and particularly since the humanities interact with our ideological values, our political perspectives, they're much more kind of complex and multivariate. I think there are probably a finite number of ways to effectively teach Physics 101. I imagine it's a 2-digit number on some level if you kind of played it all out. If you're talking about teaching American history or literature or sociology or philosophy, I imagine that the number of ways that make sense and are valuable to people is many times that. And the nature of the education is probably more deeply interpersonal for a lot of reasons. And so in some ways, I think what technology is just going to kind of instigate something of a rationalization process, whereas right now, every different kind of education is shoved through the same process. The degrees take the same amount of time to finish. They cost the same amount in terms of tuition. They're all located inside the same institutions with the same sort of very similar set of administrative structures, mechanisms for public subsidy. they're actually much more like one another than they want to admit. I think things are going to kind of break apart and go in some different and probably unexpected directions as a result of what's happening.
Okay. So in theory, we should start seeing the effects of the online education revolution pretty soon. I mean, I take your point that it's already happening, but as far as the MOOC part of it, the big MOOC platforms like Coursera, and I taught a course on Coursera from Princeton last year, they were originally not trying to do credentialing much, if at all. In other words, the course I taught, there was no credit. Princeton didn't even offer one of these kind of, more or less phony certificates of accomplishment that some do, even though they don't count as college credit anyway. So students just took them for purposes of intrinsic motivation only, I guess. But now Coursera, at least, is making a big push for what they're calling signature courses, where you actually do receive credit. And so if that's starting to happen, and some Coursera people were on campus recently, and they showed us some graphs seeming to indicate that there was some non-trivial adoption of the signature path. I don't know what the real story is, but so in theory, this is just now, with the MOOCs, I mean, this is just now getting off the ground, right? Where the MOOCs are giving students something they can actually show to employers that employers will care about.
Yeah, I think, in a way, the MOOC phenomenon was a bit of a repeat of what happened 10 years before. And I go over this in the book a little bit, where during the dot-com boom, there was a big push by some elite universities to get online. Columbia spent millions of dollars spearheading this thing called Fathom.com, which was to do basically the same thing. The great courses from Columbia, we were going to sell them to the world. Of course, not for Columbia credit, just because we're Columbia. And of course, people will want to pay us money to learn from us. It turns out like the market price of just learning even from an elite university is not very high. If there's no credentials attached to it, people are not going to pay anything resembling college prices for it. So, as you said, Coursera is now experimenting with these signature track. edX is doing it also. The example I think I gave in the article you mentioned was they have a data science program that is through Johns Hopkins. It's 9 4-week classes. You get a verified certificate, and the price is $497. So it's not free. It is a whole lot less than it would cost you to pay Johns Hopkins to teach you in Baltimore. I mean, by probably an order of magnitude, at least. That sort of middle ground between purely free and open and kind of relentlessly more expensive, I think there is a huge amount of that middle ground. And I think it's where anyone who's trying to make a business out of this in the future will try to find the right combination of service and price.
Okay. Now, in this New York Times piece you just wrote, you spent a certain amount of time talking about these things called badges. I mean, kind of going into detail about the form of credentialing that's starting to happen with online courses, and it includes the ability of employers to get into some fine-grained detail, in principle, even looking, I guess, at how you did on particular quizzes and stuff, right? And you think that's important and that's going to happen more and more?
Yeah, so there's two things that are interesting about badges. One is, as you said, it's an electronic credential that both signals something in and of itself, but is also a portal to a lot more information sitting behind it. So it's sort of like you take a picture on your iPhone, there's the image, but sort of sitting in the file is the GPS location of where you took it, and the exposure and kind of information about the device that took it and the time of day and all those things. And so too with a badge, in theory, you can kind of dive in there and find out who issued it and when and how long does it last and what did this person have to do to earn this badge, which is very different than a paper college transcript, which doesn't automatically provide access to any of that information. The second thing about open badges is that they're not limited to colleges. So in theory, any organization with credibility can give somebody a certification that they learned something that could be used in some kind of employment context. How that all shakes out, how employers learn to sort of digest new credentialing systems, I think is very much to be determined. It's probably going to take some time, and by that I mean like a matter of like some years to figure it out. But that's also the thing that really is the the precursor to a change in the economics of higher education. Not a change in free, good college classes. We're already there now. A change in how people can get credentials.
Mm-hmm. And do you think traditional kind of colleges, physical campuses of the kind we have now, will respond to the challenge of online education by putting more data about student accomplishment online? I mean, maybe with the permission of students or something. Because in principle, everything you described in this New York Times piece in the way of online data about your performance as a student, it could be done with a traditional college.
All of it could be done with a traditional college. It's a very interesting kind of organizational behavior question to think about whether colleges will or won't react. And so on the one hand, betting against traditional colleges is kind of a dumb thing to do. I mean, they have turned out to be some of the most enduring of all human organizations. The one that I think that you're sitting in right now predates the United States of America.
True.
There's not that many organizations for which that's true. They've proved to be adaptable in many ways. On the other hand, I think it's almost hard to overstate how much traditional colleges are wedded to the college as we know it, and how much they really just want to keep being that and don't want to make a lot of really tough decisions about fundamentally changing incentive structures and professional values and where the money goes from here to there. Mm-hmm. So they could all do it. Some will, I think many won't.
Okay. And finally, if we could get back to something we touched on a little bit, which is just the distinction between humanities and more kind of technical, scientific engineering and so on courses. First of all, I want to know if you actually share an assumption I made earlier that I didn't really make explicit. It's about why humanities education may not be scalable online. And it comes somewhat from my experience teaching this course I taught online, which was about Buddhism. So it was, and psychology, but it was kind of a humanities course. And, one thing I could not do was read essays generated by tens of thousands of students. On the other hand, there are things they're experimenting with, and one thing we did in this course was we had peer evaluation. So in other words, students, if they chose to do the essay, the midterm essay, they were agreeing to read 5 other students' essays and assess them. So every student got feedback from 5 other students. And that's I think there's data showing that can actually amount to reasonably skillful feedback. But anyway, there's that. And of course, in the long run, there's like artificial intelligence, machines reading essays and so on, I guess. But is it your view that for the foreseeable future, there is going to be this distinction? I mean, you can obviously machine grade a math exam, a lot of engineering exams, but the humanities, for various reasons, are not going to scale in the same way.
Yes and no. So here's what I mean by that. Yes, in the sense that certain things are 100% machine scoreable. So I took a whole genetics class from MIT that I talk about in the book. I took the same midterms and finals that the students at MIT took, all automatically graded. And not just multiple choice. I mean, some of it is like, here's a virtual DNA laboratory, manipulate the following gene sequence in a way that produces the following mutation. Mm-hmm. So you can either do that or not do that, and the computer can figure out whether you got it right. Other things, and artificial intelligence, I actually think, will be an important part of education, not in reading essays, because I sort of highly doubt, maybe it's my bias as a writer, but I kind of highly doubt that computers will ever be that smart. But there's a lot of really interesting ways that AI is being used in terms of adaptive learning experiences, changing the nature of the learning, not so much assessing you once you're done. But let's say that you're totally right. So so you had your class in Buddhism. Let's just look at kind of the model colleges have already created. Let's say that everything about your class is scalable except for hiring a teaching assistant who can meet with your students in person once a week in, say, a group of 30 and grade 30 students' exams. How much do you think that costs in total to hire that person? Just guess. How much would it cost per person?
One person per year, or?
One person per semester.
Well, if they're exploiting grad students as usual, they probably spend about $10,000 on it, or I don't know what.
So, like, you would pay that. Well, you wouldn't pay a grad student $10,000. I mean, you can hire an adjunct right now to teach a whole class for about $4,000, right? So,
okay.
So let's say it was $3,000 that you paid somebody to lead that discussion group of 30 people. That means it's $100 a person, right? I have my math right?
I'll trust you.
So 100 times 30, it's 3,000.
We'll review the videotape
yeah.
and pass judgment.
So doesn't that mean that therefore for $100 somebody could take a version of your humanities class that really does involve a real person, both helping them learn and then giving them the kind of real feedback that a good humanities class requires?
Yeah, I guess if you can do the logistics of hooking each student up with this person they're paying $100, yeah. Yeah. So in principle, you could add that. I mean, and in theory, that person could be in India, and the student could be in Des Moines, and I could be in New Jersey.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't know about virtual reality, but I'm pretty sure that 10 years from now, you're a little blurry on the screen in front of me. I'm pretty sure 10 years from now, the experience of me looking at you is not going to be all that different than if you were actually sitting across from me in the room. Different, but how different, I guess.
Yeah, no, I agree there. I mean, there have been, even the last month has brought some new products online that are pretty impressive in the virtual reality department.
Yeah.
So then finally, kind of again, about the humanities, if it turns out to be the case that in response to this kind of unbundling of education, where you don't have to take courses except those that are of immediate pragmatic vocational value, if it turns out to be the case that a lot more people enter the workforce without ever having taken a history course, a philosophy course, literature course, well, first of all, to what extent do you think that's going to be the case? And secondly, how much does it concern you, if at all?
Well, this is another one of those things where I think we have to be sort of mindful of the current state of things. I think you've just described the current state of things. I really believe that if you look at the degrees that are conferred by American universities, they are overwhelmingly professional degrees. People go, they get degrees in business, they get degrees in accounting, they get degrees in education, they get degrees in healthcare. People go to college mostly to enter the white-collar workforce because that's the only place where there are good jobs in America. By and large, you do not have to engage with the liberal arts or the great ideas in any serious way to get one of those degrees. Colleges are not set up that way. They have very, very weak distribution requirements. It's like going to a diner. There are 5 zillion courses. Pick one of these 100. Pick one of these. Pick one of these. You're well-rounded. I think that's like 98% nonsense. I think that's too bad. I think it's both necessary and important and vital to give people access to a high-quality exposure to the liberal arts at the same time that we allow them to enter the white-collar workforce. How we think about whether or not we have a responsibility as educators or people setting education policy to try to shift that more toward the mandatory side of things is a good question. Because I think you're right. I think people will, if they can take a faster, cheaper path to a job, they will take it. Some things could be lost, and we should be concerned about that.
So on the one hand, you think there's a strong case to be made for a robust core curriculum requirement. On the other hand, you're saying, don't kid yourself, very few colleges have that right now anyway.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, well, listen, thank you.
Thank you.
The book's called The End of College, Creating the Future of Learning and the University of Everywhere. And it just came out, and it's getting a lot of attention. Congratulations.
Thanks.
And I'll let you move on to your next media hit.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Bye-bye.